Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Learning how to weave but need the right shuttle? Hooked on knitting and in search of a lofty yarn? Yarn Barn of Kansas has been your partner in fiber since 1971. Whether you are around the corner from the Yarn Barn of Kansas or around the country, they are truly your local yarn store with an experienced staff to answer all your fiber questions. Visit yarnbarn-ks.com to shop, learn, and explore. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Jess Zafarris is an etymologist, editor, and author. Her most recent book is Words from Hell. She is a host of the podcast Words Unraveled. Jess, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm so excited to be here.
So you and I, once upon a time, like 5 years ago, used to work together when you were working at Writer's Digest and I was at Spin-Off. And so it is great to see you and talk about where our work overlaps now, which is like words and textiles and how important those are.
It's been quite a journey. I always enjoyed working alongside all of the different publications and events that were dedicated to the textile arts because I felt like I was immersed in creativity all the time, which helped write about or helped me develop content for Writer's Digest, helped me think more creatively when I was at How and Print, which were more graphic design focused. So it was such a wonderfully creative space for at least part of the time that we were there.
Yeah. Well, and I have sort of separately been really enjoying your books. You have most recently Words from Hell, and then you have a podcast which is just auspiciously named Words Unraveled.
Exactly, which I think is really what brought us here together, right? Is like
Absolutely.
We have this, at least thematically, unraveling is something we both do. And in this podcast, we will be unraveling some of the words behind textiles.
Mm-hmm. I love the way that folks who are engaged in textile pursuits, who are deeply immersed in it, I like the fact that being a nerd has been kind of rehabilitated. And so saying, I am going to talk to somebody about etymology, which we can enthusiastically say is a kind of a, the intersection of textiles and etymology is a kind of a delightfully nerdy pursuit.
It is for a couple of reasons. I mean, we could call it like threademology, for example, which I think is fun. But we had talked before this, we had talked about the serendipitous overlap between the words text and textile, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because text itself means a thing woven. So the stories that we spin, the words we use, and the literal fabric that covers our bodies and the wonderful journeys that we follow along every thread are all intertwined.
And I think that both of these things are kind of what makes us human, not to be all sort of misty-eyed, but making cloth and using and recording words are sort of essentially human endeavors.
Mm-hmm. And there are so many textile arts that are also storytelling mediums. Think of like tapestries too.
Oh.
And you can also, you can learn so much about people and their own stories and their own worldviews by the way they dressed and the way they interacted with fabrics and textiles throughout history.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, if we weren't talking for an audience of textile folks, there would be so many other things that we would go into, like to spin a yarn or spindle shanks or to stitch something together or from whole cloth. And I think that for textile people, a lot of those maybe feel familiar, maybe not all of them, but it's just sort of a metaphor that we use a lot.
Absolutely. It's gorgeous.
And actually, there's one that I discovered, the word sutra, which we think of as being sort of a spiritual term.
Ooh, is it
also
related
from the word thread?
Oh, that makes sense. Would that also be related to the word suture, I wonder?
Ooh.
Like in the surgery sense?
I don't know.
Different kind of threading, I suppose.
That's true. It's, yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
So interesting. This reminds me, a lot of the words that I researched in the lead up to this podcast proved to me that the textile arts are surprisingly metal. Like the word, the word yarn comes from a Proto-Indo-European root that means guts or entrails, which I think is so hardcore.
Wow.
And the storytelling sense of yarn, you mentioned spin a yarn. That's also like a nautical sense. The overlap is a story that you might tell while, say, twisting textiles to make nets or other things that you might need to use on the sea, sails, I'm sure, as well.
I wonder if the old yar comes from yarn or whether that's just something that yarn people like to pretend nowadays on Talk Like a Pirate Day.
I have a guess here, having done a nautical etymology episode, that one is a little more recent and probably from some of the adaptations of Treasure Island that happened well after the golden age of pirates, but I do like the energy.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
The word fabric, too, I guess it's not quite as hardcore, but it was originally a word for building, like a thing constructed, built, or fabricated. And it was more associated with like structures. But then in the 17th century, it became a word for a structure or another thing made by a craftsperson. And it wasn't until the 18th century that it became first a word for a manufactured material in industrial production, and then to textiles and cloth in the late 1700s. Which makes sense because it would have coincided with the industrialization of textile production.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I had the word for fabriquer or fabrication or those sorts of words that I think of from French or that's where I know them from. So.
French and Latin, absolutely.
Yeah.
Most words that came to English via French originally came from Latin, but not all of them. So, speaking of which, since we're globetrotting already, I was thinking we could talk about fabric from around the world.
Oh, that would be great.
Fabric names. For example, muslin is originally from the Italian name of the city of Mosul, which is now Iraq, but it dates back to ancient Mesopotamia.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think, I knew that the history of muslin has changed a lot, so that once upon a time, there were these daka, I'm probably going to say so many words wrong, but these muslins that were so incredibly fine that the story was that you could be wearing 7 layers of it and someone would still tell you, go put on some clothes. You can't come out here naked.
So delicate.
But now muslin has come to mean sort of it's a cotton fabric. It's often undyed. It's just sort of something that you might use to, say, drape a practice garment or something like that. So it's just kind of ordinary cotton.
I think of wearing a romantic shift or something, like a medieval undergarment of some kind, but it's probably a bit of an anachronism.
Well, I think, it's through the centuries, I think it got more and more ordinary until, unfortunately, not quite as special as it used to be in Mosul.
Right. And the Middle East is the source of several different types of fabric because it was a center of fabric production, largely during the Crusades and later, which is how a lot of these words ended up in English. So we've got damask, named after the city of Damascus in Syria, which boasted this thriving global fabric trade. Kashmir, of course, comes from, I'm sorry, this is not the Middle East. It comes from the Himalayan region of Kashmir, where it was made from Kashmir goats and wool dating back surprisingly recently. I thought this one was a little older, but it goes back to the 1800s. I thought it was kind of neat that Argyle, which it probably predictably comes from Argyll, Scotland, or Argyll, Scotland, and was a word used by the Campbell clan. Tartan itself is thought to be originally from a word for a different type of fabric, a silk from Tyre. I'm probably mispronouncing that place name. Tyre in Lebanon, it's Tyre, which is influenced by the word Tartars. The Tartars are an ethnic group that had been distributed across the Middle East and Asia for centuries. This would have been the 14th century, probably again post-Crusades influence. But then variations of the word were picked up by Scottish Highlanders in the early 1500s and made into the tartans we know today.
It's interesting, speaking of that Kashmir region in the Himalayas, which it's not, there was definitely the influence of the Mughals. So there was definitely coming through that area. And Kashmir shawls, which now we think of Kashmir as being this goat, which was kind of around the Himalayas. And it's just sort of any kind of a goat that produces this delightful fiber. But it was then made into extraordinarily fine shawls that were somewhat called Indian shawls, and I can't remember which century it was. I think it was either 18th or 19th century Britain. They were so valuable that you could buy a house or you could buy an Indian shawl. They were about similar in price. They were so valuable. And people didn't like paying all that money, and they wanted to make them locally. So they made them in Paisley, Scotland, which is so the term Paisley is for that sort of teardrop shaped symbol, which in Persian is the word for it is something like bota, and it's thought to be kind of like a mango seed.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
So we sort of adopted that.
Another one from the Middle East is gauze, surprisingly, is thought to come from the name of Gaza in Palestine, which is very interesting. It's made of synthetic fibers now, but when we say that something is gauzy, we're referring to the original sense, which was a type of silk. It was used for clothing like ballerinas, tutus, and it was also very fine and delicate. Silk is also pretty interesting since we're on that. It means fabric from the Syrinx or Ceres, which was a name that the Greeks gave to people from various parts of northern China who traded silks to them. It's a little chicken eggy situation here because it's not clear whether silk is named after the Ceres or Syrinx people or the Greeks were just calling the people from that region the silk people.
Oh, wow. That fits in nicely with the idea that the fact that silk was restricted, that it couldn't be exported, or the knowledge in how to produce it couldn't be exported from that part of China. So it makes sense that would be so closely identified with that place.
I wonder if maybe, that could also explain why sort of similar fabrics like satins were created. And satin is named after a place in China, but the name that we use is from the Arabic name for the place, which is zaytun or zaytuni. The Z changed to an S, probably by association with silk.
Right. Huh. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, speaking of regional and beasts, which is, I suppose, silk is a beast as well as cashmere, the word Angora, for which we now have rabbits, I think we have cats, and dear to my heart are those cute little curly goats. And that's for the Turkish city of Ankara, where they were known for producing a whole variety of different fine fibers.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other place names that we have?
Well, I think some people are aware at this point of jeans and denim. So jeans is a fabric from Genoa, and denim the word is denim, which is a city in France. And both of those are sort of near the sea, near the Mediterranean. So they were cloth. It was a cloth that was somehow associated with sailors, which I guess is how we get our sort of hardworking denim these days.
I could be making this up, but I want to say like those wide sailor pants that you could like kick off if you went into the ocean were like made of what they originally called denim.
Mm-hmm. So there is a word sleazy, which I think people don't recognize has any sort of textile connection at all. I didn't realize it had a place connection. So it is named after a fabric from Silesia, which is sort of in Eastern Europe. And it referred to a kind of fabric that was very cheap. It would kind of fall apart. And so in weaving, sleazy is for a fabric where the warp and weft threads kind of slide around on each other. It doesn't really have structural integrity. And so now sleazy is also a person who doesn't have any sort of moral integrity. So it's kind of made a journey. Yeah.
I love that metaphor we have there. And then of course there's tawdry, right? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So tawdry is named after Saint Audrey, which poor Saint Audrey, she had a much, like Aethelrude, I think. It's shortened from a longer name. And she had a goiter, poor thing. And she blamed it on having worn jewelry when she was young, being a saint. She had renounced all this. And so on Saint Audrey's Day, they would cheap necklace or neckwear sold. And so this lace, sort of cheap lace, became symbolic of poor St. Audrey, but this was not well made. It was sort of dressed up and
like faux fancy.
Exactly.
Maybe cheap but ostentatious at the same time.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's
and that kind of goes along with actually, there is one other word that I was thinking of that comes from a place, which is calico, which is from the British word is colicut, but the word in Malayalam is, and I should be able to say this, but I can't, Coricode, which was a kind of printed textile I think it was resist dyed, but it was a printed textile from southern India.
Is that why calico cats are also called that? Is it because of the place name, or is it because their patterns are similar to the textile?
I think it's from the patterns.
That's neat. Mm-hmm.
I think they're not particularly known for cats in that part of India. So.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I wondered because, there are parts of Turkey where there are cats everywhere. So I wondered if maybe that region also venerated its cats.
Well, maybe that's where those very sweet, soft little Angora cats come from.
Oh, my goodness. They're so pretty. Since we're on the topic of words like tawdry, how about the word shoddy? That's from a type of wool, right?
I think it's for a treatment of wool. So there are still shoddy mills where they take, and you probably know more about the history. What I know of shoddy mill is that it's a place where fabric is sort of deconstructed and taken apart to be turned into new thread and made into new fabric. But because they've already been used, it's often shorter. It's not as nice and strong and fine and white. Usually you want fabric to be white so that you can dye it another color. And there's actually a whole book about the shoddy trade, but there's a shoddy trade as well as something being shoddily made.
Interesting. So the way the word came to be a pejorative or a negative term, which this process, when it happens, when a word becomes like a standard, normal, neutral term and then becomes more negative, is called pejoration or pejoration. And then if you make a word like nicer over time, it's called amelioration. But the way this word was made into a pejorative was through the American Civil War, because this type of wool was used to create like government supplies that were then distributed to armies, and they were made to look like nice because, during the Civil War, the uniforms looked sort of formal, but they were not. They were not well made. So something shoddy meant originally something, well, in that sense, meant having a deceptive appearance of high quality.
Oh, that is very interesting. That's the deceptive part of it. That's
right. So now something shoddy is something that's poorly made.
Right. I was finding in this delightful little book, Rigmaroles and Ragamuffins by Eleanor Capp, the word drab is from a similar idea where it was a particular kind of cloth from the Quakers. And it was just a sort of a color. And it was this just kind of, the idea was that it was just this unornamented, undressed up cloth that you would wear to not show off. And it has kind of taken on this other larger word. I guess it has a similar tone, but it's bigger than just wearing ordinary plain cloth.
So wearing drab or dressing in a drab way usually was more specific back in the day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then we have a color, olive drab, which I guess is probably related to the same thing. That's that sort of sad, unexciting kind of a gray-green color.
Right. We must be very Puritan with our drabs, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's see. On the more exciting side, one that we talked about before we recorded this was bombast and bombastic, right?
I know.
The word for cotton padding. Can you tell us how that cotton padding was used?
Sure. So it is part of a costume. You would pad it out with more cotton so that it looked bigger and more substantial in these sort of fancy puffed sleeves, and you would pad it with bombast. And that sort of idea of not really being real, you were padded but not real, you were making yourself bigger so that you could sort of metaphorically make yourself bigger. You could use big words as opposed to just having big clothes.
And the root of this is bombyx, which is the Latin and Greek word for silk, right?
Back to silk.
Exactly. And while researching this, I learned about the word bombazine, which I hadn't heard before, but it's a word for twilled or corded dress material made of inexpensive silk and wool in a solid color. And it also comes from the same root, which is interesting.
There are so many words for types of fabric that we just don't have anymore. Kinds of fabric that had an author who was diving deep into something called Kashmir, which just isn't a fabric that we make anymore. I don't even know what it is.
Sounds super cool, though.
It does sound super cool. Yeah.
Sounds like a name. Another word that comes from the textile arts, shifting just a little bit. I was very excited to learn that every sense of the word rocket comes from the textile arts because it was originally and remains a word for a bobbin. And all kinds of rockets, including spacefaring rockets and fireworks, are all named for their comparison to a bobbin.
I did not know that. That's amazing.
It's from the Italian roschetto, meaning a bobbin or a small distaff. Speaking of which, I think you have some info on distaff, right?
I do. Well, distaff, for folks who don't spin, might not be aware of a distaff, which was a stick or a little framework, or in some cases, it's even just something you hang on your wrist. And it's what you use to hold the fiber before you spin it. Because if you're going to be spinning for a while, you don't want to stop and put down your spinning equipment and pick up some more fiber. So it could be attached to your spinning wheel, or you might put it in your belt to wear. But the distaff side is often in sort of genealogy terms, is the woman's side of the family. Spinning being such a womanly art.
That brings me to one of my favorite etymology facts of all time. And it's around the word spinster, which is used as a negative term. Well, kind of now. I mean, we don't typically call people spinsters nowadays, but it is typically associated through, recent literature of the past couple of centuries for a unmarried woman in her older years. And originally it was a word for a woman who spins thread for a living. It's structured in the same way as words like teamster or punster or jokester. It's the word spin with an agent noun ending on it. But that agent noun ending used to be exclusively female and correspond to the ending ER, or the gender neutral or masculine ending ER. But its association with women who never marry, especially but not exclusively, those of non-noble birth, is based on the tradition that those who are unwed should take up a women-appropriate profession like spinning. And that ster ending is found in tons of Middle English women's professions. And they exist also in modern day last names, surnames. Some of them, are not names, but like in Middle English, a seamstress was called a sewster because the French-derived ESS ending had not fully integrated into English at the time. A whitester was a woman who bleaches cloth. A knitster was a woman who knits. A webster was a woman weaver, and that corresponded to Weber, a man who weaves for a living. In fact, the Old and Middle English surnames that still exist today, Brewster was a woman who brews for a living. A Baxter was literally a bakester, a woman who bakes, corresponding to a baker. All these were professions that were performed often by women. And they're presumably, some of those names that exist now came down from women tradesmen. So I think that one's super interesting.
I didn't realize that there were male and female professional weavers captured in that Weber-Webster name.
Isn't that neat? Let's see. So the like pejorative edge on spinster also appeared around the same time. And it was through that sort of stereotype that if you didn't marry, you were lesser for some reason, which is silly. But there were also words like chidester and scoldster, and these were like women who would chide you too much, something along those lines. And it didn't become gender neutral until like the 1600s or 1700s.
I just love the idea of sewster. I've kind of gotten used to the word sewist, which is something that's commonly used these days, partly because sewer, which is what you would naturally say, looks like sewer when you write it down. So people have become sewists, but I would like sewster.
Hey, we can make it a thing. We'll just start calling people sewsters.
Sewsters.
My mom makes costumes for movies and TV shows, and sometimes she is in a seamster role. So I think we should make her a sewster or a seamster.
Seamster, like a teamster, but a seamster.
Exactly. I think that makes more sense.
Yes, that's definitely better.
So we have another word from space, right? Not just rocket. What else do we have?
So shuttle is now a word from space. I was thinking about the shuttle to the airport, but it's true that is also a space shuttle word. And it's one of those things that was so obvious when I thought about it, that it's going back and forth the way that a shuttle passes back and forth in the shed of cloth when you're weaving. But it had never occurred to me that that's where shuttle was from. The going back and forth part is from weaving.
That makes perfect sense. My understanding is that the word warp, when we talk about like warp speed, that's also originally from like the textile sense of warp, because it implies bending space-time, much in the sense that warp was a bending of you're going to know this better than I am, but apparently it also corresponds to the idea of like the fabric of space-time.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that warp, because the warp is the long straight out in front of you held under tension. And I guess, a warp bends when you go around the back beam, but
Mm-hmm.
it's usually held pretty much straight.
Interesting. And I wonder if maybe it's the sense that it's like weaving through perpendicular threads.
I don't know, maybe. And then, of course, there's something being warped, which is a much older idea. And I should have looked into where that comes from. Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, the root just means to turn or bend, but evidently it would not have entered sci-fi language if not for the textile sense, much in the same way that we call things like fabric of space-time.
That's true. Yeah.
Here's a neat one that I learned the other day. Polka dots as a pattern. They were popularized in the 1800s, early 1800s. I thought they were a little more recent, but apparently they are early 1800s. And in the early to mid 1800s, polka dancing was very popular. And apparently the only association between polka dots and polka dancing is that both were popular at the same time. So you might wear your polka dots to go polka dancing.
Oh, that's so funny.
Chintzy is also pattern related, right?
Yeah, the chintzy is kind of heartbreaking. I mean, well, maybe this is just my soapbox. So chintz is a fabric that originated in India, and it was a beautiful painted coated textile, which was very popular. And so it was imported into the UK, much like the Kashmir shawl, and it was fairly expensive. And so it was made locally, and the version that was made locally was not as good. So George Eliot is actually the person who is thought to have coined this term, that something was rather chintzy, that it was sort of not as good. It was...
No kidding.
And unfortunately, what that represents is this sort of, once again, taking of something that was fabulous and special and refined, and it's sort of being, I guess, brought down to something that people could afford locally. But it was also sort of this story about the British exploitation of the Indian textile industry, in which you would just never stop crying. So,
oof. Oh my goodness, so much there.
Mm-hmm.
Much in the same way that like the Crusades brought us many textile words.
Right, yeah.
Oof.
Yep.
One thing that I think is interesting, a recurring factor we have here is a lot of these words have been popularized or normalized in everyday speech through not just the work of, but like cultural influence of women. And the same is true for the felt hat called a fedora. If you're a theater aficionado, you've probably heard of Sarah Bernhardt. She was a famous French stage actress in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and she played the lead in tons of French plays by like Alexandre Dumas and Victor Hugo, and she was one of the first big actresses to act and make like sound recordings in motion pictures. But she's also really well known for playing male roles, like she played Hamlet in 1899. She was one of the first women ever to publicly and popularly wear a pantsuit. And another thing that she popularized was the fedora hat. In the 1880s, she wore a hat in that style as she performed the role of the title character in the play Fedora by Victorian Sardou, which is about a Russian princess named Fedora Romazov. So it was more popular as a women's hat first, and then Prince Edward started wearing one in 1924, and that made it more popular for men.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Speaking of felt, I think that one's interesting too, because it's been pronounced and spelled the same way since Old English, because it describes the like pounding or beating of the fibers to make that felt. And the same, I think, is true of the word batting, which means like beating wool.
Wow, I didn't realize that. That's amazing. Well, there is a word that's the idea of being on tenterhooks takes its root from something not being felted per se, but being washed and fulled. And after you had washed and sort of roughed up and fulled some fabric, you would hang it out and stretch it out. And those big metal spikes and hooks were called tenterhooks. So it would be very unpleasant. Yes, it would be very unpleasant to be on tenterhooks.
Interesting. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Another one that it was originally a philosophy word, but we tend to associate like the word synthetic with fabrics today, with a variety of things, but largely it's common in the textile world. And originally it means to put things together. Synthetic reasoning is deductive reasoning. In mathematical logic, synthetic reasoning is juxtaposed with analytic reasoning. Analytic reasoning is information you can reasonably understand without additional context. One of the examples I've read is that like surgeons are doctors. That is analytic reasoning. And then synthetic reasoning would be surgeons are rich, which is like it relies on additional knowledge that doctors tend to earn higher salaries. You have to put those two things together. And it was transitioned to fabrics because they like synthetic, well, chemistry first and then into textiles because it's different things being put together to make a new thing.
Yeah, that's true. Just kind of in the opposite direction, I think people have often forgotten when we talk about something being flaxen. I'm not sure that everybody realizes that flaxen is related to linen. And so flax is the plant that grows. And if you hadn't seen flax being processed, you might not think this nice green plant with blue flowers, which is then retted, it goes through a process and it gets kind of dull and then it is hackled or heckled, in some cases, heckled to remove all the not so great bits. And it becomes this sort of white golden color that we think of as flaxen. And so when you think of somebody having flaxen hair, that's related to having very, very fine linen hair. And so it is not so crazy to think that Rumpelstiltskin was going to spin a room of straw into gold because he was spinning a room of flax into golden thread.
Amazing. That's very cool. And that, like you said, heckling, and I just had to look this up to see, but it is heckling originally referred to this process, like all kinds of heckling. It was to comb flax or hemp with a heckle, which is, I guess, a tool, like a comb for flax, which is very cool.
It's a tool with very pointy spikes and rough edges, so it strips off all of the unwanted bits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Once again, it would be very unpleasant to go through one.
Exactly. It's like being questioned to uncover weaknesses and imperfections in your logic. That's so interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we think about red tape, something being tied up in red tape, I don't know about you, I tend to sort of have this mental image of like red electrical tape, or a red tape like you would run across a line. But the red tape was used by King Charles V of Spain, I think, and it was more like a red ribbon. So somebody must have woven this ribbon that was being used to tie up these official documents.
No
so
kidding.
That was the red tape.
Oh, wow. That's so much more interesting than I thought it would be. Very cool. One that I hadn't quite thought this through, though now that I have realized it, it seems obvious. The word like kerchief and handkerchief, the ker element, typically a lot of times when it's added to words, sometimes means to cover. So a kerchief, and then chief, of course, means head. So a kerchief is a covering for your head, quite literally. And a handkerchief is a hand covering for your head. Though just by extension, it was the difference between a kerchief that a woman would wear on her head and a one that you might keep in your hand, but is the same shape.
Well, in your kerchief these days might be a bandana, which is once again from an Indian word, which is bandani or bandani, which is a tied resist dye technique. It's a very intricate technique where you tie little teeny tiny knots in a pattern and you immerse it in a dye bath. And when you take off the ties and the little tiny dots, you have a beautiful pattern, often a white pattern, which is why our bandana pattern, which also has these paisley symbols often, has these little white dots. And it's from this traditional technique.
That is so interesting. I learned not too long ago that the word corduroy is a little bit of a mystery, but it has an interesting like folk etymology possibility to it. It's supposed to be the cord du roi or cord du roi, meaning the king's cord, but there's no evidence that anyone actually used that term for anything in French. So it may have been a term that like English people made up for corduroy, kind of on the assumption that kings would wear it. And there was a similar fabric, but it was called in French velours à cotte, which you can imagine is related to velour, which is an alteration of the French word for velvet. So it implies that corded or ridged surface. But the second half of the word in English for corduroy isn't precisely known.
Wow. Let's just make it king's cord, it just like...
Yeah, I like that. It probably, folk etymology essentially led it to be that. It would be interesting. I don't think that corduroy is typically associated with royalty these days, though.
No. It's more associated with winter.
Every time us average people wear it, we can be very kingly, right?
That's true. Actually, there's one word that I came across that one of my colleagues has written about. The term is drizzling, which is a technique that was very popular. I think it was in the 19th century that or maybe the late 18th century, for picking out the golden thread. You'd have something that was woven or embroidered with gold or precious metal. And it was actually, some people did it for money and some people just did it as a hobby. Here, let's pick all the gold out of this. And apparently the sound that this made was related to the pitter-patter of raindrops. That's Eleanor
so
Kapp suggested that was so. I don't know what the exact etymology, I can't trace it with a date, but I just love that idea.
That is lovely. I like that suggestion. An interesting one with maybe a similar like motion sense is the word scarlet, which was a word for a fabric in English before it was a word for a color. Though in Old French and Latin, it was also a word for the red color or any fine fabric of any color. It's thought to mean like sheared cloth, where the shearing is referring to like fabric with a raised texture, which I'm sure you knew. There were even like shearmen. It was a job in the medieval era who would nap cloth manually and then shear them to create that raised texture. And it was applied to the color probably because it was expensive fabric with a detailed process, and it was dyed in rich hues, including that red.
Yes, and red was often quite expensive. You either had to dig up your madder roots or get cochineal insects from somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of insects, snails were the source of many purple dyes, right? And the word purple comes from the name of like porphyra, which was a word for murex snails, where we get purple dye for centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And probably still do.
And that was one of the words I loved hearing about on Words Unraveled. And you talked about purple prose as well and how
that's right,
went from dye into language.
Right, because it described anything purple could describe something royal or ostentatious or gaudy. So purple prose is bombastic, since we're on that word, and elaborate speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Since we were just talking about Words Unraveled, we should probably talk about ravel and unravel, right? Because if you look up the word ravel, you might find that it can also mean unravel, right?
Yes.
It's a contronym. That's what we call this, when a word can mean its own opposite at the same time. Same with words like sanction, which can mean to put in a ban on something, or it can mean to allow something by law. Ravel is from the Dutch ravelen, which meant to tangle or fray. So it's meant to, but even in Dutch, it meant both to entangle and to untangle.
I've just sort of always thought of unraveling meaning, for example, you're knitting, you would sort of just pull out the last stitch and keep going, and you would take out the cloth. And so I remember the first time a copy editor, I had unravel and she crossed it out and she wrote ravel. We say ravel to pull out the stitches on something. And there's sleep knits up the raveled sleeve of care. And so I've always wondered, which way is raveling going and which way is unraveling going? And so at this point, I sort of write one and wonder if someone's going to correct me.
I think this is a point of contention, because even etymology scholars don't really know exactly which way it's supposed to go. I mean, the original Dutch word meant to tangle, but I think of raveling, in my head, it calls to mind the notion of wrapping a thread around a spool, and unraveling means pulling it apart, or like pulling apart a sweater or something like that. It's one of our great mysteries, but we went with Unraveled for the name of the podcast because I think it's a little clearer. Because if we had said words raveled, I think we may have run into people who were confused about exactly what we were doing to those words.
A lot of puzzled folks, but also I think it just flows nicely. Words unraveled, it has the certain prosody, lovely prosody to it. So
I love it.
Well, Jess, thanks so much for coming and raveling these words with me.
I couldn't have been happier to follow the long threads of this podcast. This was so much fun. I'm so glad we got the opportunity to do this. And it was both a learning experience for me and an opportunity to look at some words that I hadn't before. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.